The open road offers the illusion of freedom, but stepping into a stranger's vehicle can instantly trap you in a nightmare so brutal that the raw, unedited reality of these crimes remains too graphic to be fully displayed on this platform. Today we examine the chilling, documented facts behind 10 ordinary people who simply asked for a ride, only to vanish into the passenger seats of the world's most ruthless predators. In the early 1980s, the Pacific Highway South Corridor near Seattle, Washington, represented a chaotic artery of transit where the marginalized and the transient frequently converged. This sprawling, neon-lit stretch of road became a grim sanctuary for runaway teenagers, struggling mothers, and sex workers who routinely relied on the precarious practice of hitchhiking to navigate their challenging daily lives. During this era, stepping into the passenger seat of a stranger's vehicle was often viewed not as a life-threatening gamble, but rather as a grim necessity for survival in an unforgiving economic landscape. The women who walked this highway were daughters, sisters, and friends who maintained ordinary human desires for safety and stability, even as their circumstances forced them into highly vulnerable positions. As they stood on the damp asphalt under the heavy Pacific Northwest rain, extending a thumb to passing headlights, they trusted an unspoken social contract that a temporary ride would end safely at their intended destination. Their daily routines involved moving from cheap motels to diners, relying heavily on the fleeting charity of motorists, passing through the densely forested region of King County. Nobody in this bustling transient community could have possibly anticipated that the familiar hum of approaching truck engines and station wagons was about to become the soundtrack to a sprawling tragedy. The dense wilderness surrounding the highway stood as a silent, imposing witness to the countless brief interactions between vulnerable pedestrians and anonymous drivers that occurred every single night. For a brief period, the highway maintained a fragile equilibrium, where the sheer volume of transient traffic masked the presence of an apex predator, patiently studying the terrain. It was an environment perfectly calibrated for a hunter who understood that society often looks away from those who live on the margins, ensuring that when the disappearances finally began, they would initially go entirely unnoticed by the broader public. The fragile illusion of safety along the Pacific Highway South shattered irreparably during the summer of 1982, when the first undeniable evidence of a systemic slaughter surfaced in the murky waters of the Green River. Authorities were abruptly jolted into action when two young boys maneuvering a raft discovered the submerged remains of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield, a runaway who had last been seen alive entering an unidentified vehicle. Less than a month later, the grim recovery of Deborah Lynn Bonner's body from the very same river confirmed the terrifying reality that a highly organized serial killer was actively operating within King County. This chilling pattern of discoveries established a clear and sinister modus operandi, indicating that the perpetrator was specifically targeting vulnerable women who were hitchhiking, luring them into his vehicle under the guise of a safe ride or a commercial transaction. As more bodies were systematically pulled from the river and the surrounding dense ravines, a suffocating atmosphere of paranoia descended upon the local transient community, fundamentally altering the way women interacted with approaching vehicles. The sheer proximity of the dump sites to the water earned the unidentified assailant the moniker of the Green River Killer, a name that would soon become synonymous with America's most prolific, unsolved murder streak. Investigators quickly realized they were not dealing with isolated incidents of violence, but rather a calculated campaign of extermination carried out by an individual who possessed an intimate knowledge of the local geography and its secluded access roads. The timeline of disappearances rapidly accelerated, with multiple women vanishing within mere days of each other, leaving behind nothing but frantic rumors among the highway regulars who had witnessed them stepping into various cars and trucks. Panic began to infiltrate the previously resilient street-level networks as the realization dawned that any passing motorist offering a ride could potentially be the architect of the escalating massacre. This distinct shift from routine missing persons reports to a confirmed string of linked homicides permanently altered the investigative landscape, forcing local law enforcement to confront an unprecedented crisis that would consume their department for the next 2 decades. In response to the rapidly expanding geographic spread of victims, local authorities established the Green River Task Force, a specialized unit that would eventually become the largest serial murder investigation in United States history. Detectives found themselves completely overwhelmed by an avalanche of tips, processing tens of thousands of suspect vehicles, and conducting exhaustive interviews with men who frequented the highway corridor. Throughout the grueling investigation, a commercial truck painter named Gary Ridgway repeatedly surfaced on the police radar, initially drawing suspicion in 1983 due to a prostitution-related arrest and a disturbing choking incident reported by a surviving victim. However, the technological limitations of early 1980s forensic science allowed Ridgway to slip through the investigative net, most notably when he successfully passed a police polygraph examination in 1984, which inexplicably diverted crucial attention away from him. Despite his deceptive triumph over the polygraph, lingering suspicions prompted investigators to execute a search warrant in 1987, during which they collected saliva and hair samples from Ridgway, though they lacked the scientific tools to link these biological markers to the crime scenes. The task force was repeatedly forced to pursue agonizingly barren leads and false suspects, pouring enormous resources into dead-end profiles, while the confirmed victim count continued to climb at an alarming rate. Serial killer Ted Bundy even offered his assistance from death row, providing investigators with psychological insights into the killer's habit of revisiting the meticulously concealed dump sites. Yet this grim consultation failed to produce any immediate tactical advantage. As the years dissolved into decades, the active investigation gradually transitioned into a monumental cold case, leaving the families of the victims stranded in a torturous limbo of unresolved grief and institutional frustration. The original detectives, who had dedicated their careers to the task force, began to retire, haunted by the thousands of meticulously cataloged files and the phantom presence of a killer who seemed to have vanished into the historical record. The physical evidence collected from the bodies, microscopic traces of semen, foreign hairs, and paint spheres, remained locked in evidence vaults, silently waiting for the day when scientific advancement might finally bridge the gap between circumstantial suspicion and undeniable proof. The impenetrable darkness surrounding the Green River mystery finally fractured in 2001 when the steady, methodical progression of forensic science caught up with the meticulously preserved evidence from the 1980s. Recognizing the unprecedented capabilities of short tandem repeat DNA profiling, a newly revitalized cold case team made the critical decision to re-examine the biological evidence retrieved from the earliest victims discovered in the river. Scientists at the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory utilized this groundbreaking genetic technology to analyze the degraded semen samples, successfully isolating a distinct DNA profile that belonged to the elusive killer. In a moment of monumental historical significance, investigators cross-referenced this freshly extracted genetic sequence with the saliva swab that had been taken from Gary Ridgway all the way back in 1987. The laboratory results yielded a definitive, statistically insurmountable match, physically connecting the unassuming truck painter to the brutal murders of Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, and Carol Ann Christensen. On November 30, 2001, heavily armed tactical teams swarmed Ridgway as he was leaving his workplace in Renton, seamlessly taking into custody the man who had evaded the largest manhunt in regional history for nearly 20 years. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community and the law enforcement establishment, particularly because Ridgway presented an intensely unremarkable facade, living a quiet, domestic life with his unsuspecting wife while concealing an unimaginably dark reality. During prolonged, intensive interrogations, the psychological dam broke, and Ridgway began to coldly recount the mechanical efficiency with which he had lured unsuspecting hitchhikers into his vehicles, using photographs of his young son to project an aura of absolute safety. The chilling climax of the investigation was not a dramatic shootout or a desperate chase, but rather the sterile, clinical triumph of microscopic biology over decades of calculated deception. This forensic victory provided a definitive answer to a question that had haunted the Pacific Northwest for an entire generation, proving that no amount of time could outlast the silent, irrefutable testimony of DNA. In a highly controversial yet pragmatic maneuver designed to resolve the staggering volume of unsolved cases, King County prosecutors entered into an unprecedented plea agreement with Rigway in 2003. In exchange for permanently removing the death penalty from consideration, Rigway legally bound himself to provide comprehensive, verifiable details regarding the locations of victims whose remains had never been located by the task force. For months, the convicted serial killer led heavily guarded police convoys through the overgrown forests and logging roads of Washington, casually pointing out the obscured ravines where he had discarded the bodies of dozens of women. This macabre tour of the region ultimately resulted in 49 confirmed convictions for first-degree murder, officially cementing Rigway's status as the most prolific convicted serial killer in the history of the United States, though he casually estimated his actual victim count to be closer to 71. The legal proceedings concluded with Rigway receiving 48 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his natural life confined within the maximum security walls of the Washington State Penitentiary. While the plea deal technically provided a legal resolution, the emotional devastation inflicted upon the victims' families remains entirely unhealed, with many continuing to advocate for the identification of the partial remains that still sit nameless in the medical examiner's office. The legacy of the Green River Killer permanently eradicated the cultural acceptance of hitchhiking in the region, serving as a bleak historical marker that definitively proved the extraordinary danger inherent in accepting rides from strangers. The exhaustive documentation of his crimes continues to serve as a foundational textbook for behavioral analysts studying the dichotomy between a killer's mundane public life and his catastrophic private compulsions. As the Pacific Northwest slowly attempted to heal from a two-decade reign of terror, a very different kind of nightmare was already beginning to unfold thousands of miles away. The suffocating humidity of the Louisiana Bayou was about to breed its own phantom, where another series of shattered routines and empty passenger seats would soon paralyze an entirely new community. In the sweltering, deeply atmospheric climate of South Louisiana during the early 2000s, a deceptive tranquility blanketed the vibrant communities surrounding Baton Rouge and Lafayette. The region was characterized by its tightly knit neighborhoods, sprawling university campuses, and an overarching culture of Southern hospitality, where strangers routinely exchanged pleasantries and offered assistance to those in need. Women navigating this environment engaged in entirely ordinary routines, commuting to graduate classes, managing local businesses, and running mundane errands without the paralyzing fear of random, catastrophic violence. However, this inherent trust extended to the roadways and parking lots, where the boundary between a helpful neighbor and a dangerous predator was virtually non-existent. The prevailing belief was that horrific crimes happened in distant, chaotic metropolises, not within the familiar parishes where families had resided for multiple generations. Consequently, when a vehicle approached a pedestrian or a stranded motorist, the immediate assumption was one of communal aid rather than imminent peril. This deeply ingrained social conditioning made the local population particularly susceptible to an offender who could camouflage himself behind an unremarkable, working-class facade while operating a standard, inconspicuous vehicle. The victims who would soon be violently pulled from their comfortable lives were exceptionally diverse in their backgrounds, ranging from graduate students to professional women, unified only by their tragic geographic proximity to a mobile hunter. They lived out their final days completely oblivious to the fact that they were being actively stalked by an individual who utilized the vast, interconnected road networks of Louisiana to orchestrate his attacks. The dense humidity of the Bayou seemed to heavily insulate the region from external threats, but the true danger was already circulating daily on their own streets, patiently waiting for the optimal moment of isolation to strike. The sheer volume of transient and student traffic effectively masked the presence of a predator who methodically studied his environment. He operated with a chilling patience, ensuring that when the violence eventually erupted, it would leave local authorities grasping at shadows. The comfortable illusion of safety in South Louisiana was abruptly and violently dismantled when a terrifying sequence of disappearances and brutal homicides began to plague the once peaceful parishes. The community was initially jolted into a state of profound shock following the discovery of Gina Wilson Green in September 2001, an event that single-handedly shattered the region's collective sense of security and initiated a widespread panic. This horrifying localized tragedy rapidly escalated into a full-blown regional crisis as more women, including Charlotte Murray Pace and Pam Kinamore, were suddenly violently abducted from their daily lives, often with evidence pointing to highly organized stalking behavior. Investigators observed that the perpetrator was incredibly mobile, utilizing the extensive highway systems to quickly traverse between different jurisdictions, thereby complicating the initial law enforcement response and delaying the recognition of a cohesive pattern. The terrifying reality that a predator was actively roaming the streets, heavily relying on his vehicle to transport victims to remote dumping grounds like the desolate Whiskey Bay, fundamentally altered the daily habits of every woman residing in the area. Citizens began to view every idling truck and unfamiliar sedan with intense suspicion, recognizing that the very roads they used for their daily commutes had been weaponized into hunting grounds by an unseen assailant. The discovery of remains in heavily wooded areas directly accessible by vehicles strongly indicated that the killer possessed an intimate, logistical knowledge of the region's isolated access points and rural landscapes. This distinct methodology of using vehicular mobility to strike rapidly and vanish without a trace left local police departments struggling to establish a localized perimeter. As the threat clearly extended far beyond a single neighborhood, the escalating frequency of the murders transformed the initial shock into a sustained, suffocating terror. As the entire state realized that any woman could be targeted regardless of her socioeconomic status or neighborhood. This definitive confirmation of a highly active, vehicular-born serial killer forced a massive paradigm shift within the local authorities, triggering the formation of a multi-agency task force desperately seeking to halt the unprecedented bloodshed. Law enforcement agencies found themselves utterly bewildered by the lack of traditional connections between the victims, further underscoring the random, highly mobile nature of the attacks. The terrifying realization that stepping outside one's door could lead to a permanent disappearance cast a suffocating shadow over the entire state. As the sheer scale of the crisis became undeniably apparent, the investigative efforts were heavily bolstered by federal resources. But these well-intentioned interventions initially inadvertently severely derailed the pursuit of the killer. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit generated a highly publicized psychological profile that confidently asserted the perpetrator was a socially awkward white male, driving a heavily generalized description that sent thousands of investigators chasing the wrong demographic. Based on this fundamentally flawed profile, local authorities instituted a massive, unprecedented DNA dragnet across the region, demanding voluntary biological samples from thousands of Caucasian men who resided or worked in the affected parishes. While this staggering logistical undertaking consumed immense investigative hours and millions of dollars in laboratory testing, it continually yielded agonizing dead ends, frustrating detectives and leaving the terrified public demanding immediate results. Meanwhile, the elusive killer, entirely insulated by the authorities' aggressive pursuit of the wrong racial profile, continued his devastating campaign, striking again and expanding his geographic footprint to demonstrate his absolute impunity. The community descended into a state of hyper-vigilance, heavily arming themselves, traveling exclusively in groups, and flooding emergency dispatch centers with thousands of reports of suspicious vehicles and individuals that ultimately went nowhere. The task force investigators, laboring under immense political and public pressure, were repeatedly forced to meticulously analyze complex crime scenes that offered agonizingly little in terms of traditional, usable physical evidence. Despite the frustrating lack of visual witnesses or reliable descriptions of the suspect's vehicle, The crime scenes consistently yielded a crucial, microscopic thread, the killer's DNA, which was carefully preserved and entered into regional databases. This genetic signature became the absolute cornerstone of the investigation, serving as the only undeniable truth in a chaotic sea of misdirection, false confessions, and completely erroneous suspect sketches. The sheer persistence of the investigators in maintaining the integrity of this biological evidence proved to be the critical decision that would eventually cut through the blinding fog of the failed FBI profile and expose the true predator. Each new crime scene was meticulously combed by forensics teams who knew that a single stray hair or microscopic fluid sample was their only real weapon against a ghost. As public frustration reached a boiling point, the detectives quietly continued to catalog the biological markers, trusting the science over the dangerously misleading psychological profiles. The excruciating investigative stalemate was finally shattered in the spring of 2003 through a critical intersection of advanced forensic database management and a previously overlooked, seemingly unrelated violent encounter. A completely distinct investigation into the unsolved murder of Trenisha Dean Colomb and the brutal, surviving attack on Diane Alexander in St. Martin Parish yielded crucial biological evidence that investigators decided to run against the Baton Rouge Task Force's primary database. To the absolute astonishment of the entire law enforcement community, the laboratory results revealed an irrefutable, undeniable genetic match, definitively linking the disparate crime scenes across multiple jurisdictions to a single, highly dangerous individual. The devastating plot twist materialized when authorities finally identified the source of this unifying DNA profile, completely obliterating the long-held FBI behavioral profile that had misdirected the task force for years. The genetic sequence perfectly matched Derek Todd Lee, an African-American man with a documented history of stalking, voyeurism, and violent offenses, who had somehow managed to completely evade the massive, racially focused DNA dragnet. This monumental breakthrough instantly shifted the entire trajectory of the multi-agency manhunt, transforming Lee from an obscure, low-level offender in the local databases into the single most wanted fugitive in the United States. Armed with Lee's undeniable identity, investigators rapidly pieced together his movements, recognizing how he utilized his innocuous appearance and work vehicles to seamlessly blend into neighborhoods and highway traffic, while stalking his heavily monitored targets. Realizing the authorities were rapidly closing in on his position, Lee initiated a desperate, high-stakes flight across state lines, momentarily attempting to leverage the very same open roads he had previously used to terrorize South Louisiana. However, the sheer magnitude of the coordinated federal and local response swiftly overwhelmed his evasive tactics, culminating in his dramatic capture outside a tire shop in Atlanta, Georgia, without a single shot being fired. This clinical, scientifically driven culmination of the manhunt provided a stark contrast to the sheer brutality of his crimes, proving that the microscopic truth left at the crime scenes was vastly more powerful than years of flawed human deduction. Lee had managed to live completely undetected within the very communities he was terrorizing, hiding his monstrous compulsions behind the veil of a blue-collar worker. The stunning arrest not only relieved a paralyzed region, but also served as a monumental vindication for the cold, hard science of DNA tracking. The subsequent judicial proceedings against Derek Todd Lee were executed with swift, unyielding precision, heavily relying on the insurmountable mountain of genetic evidence that definitively tethered him to the widespread string of regional homicides. Prosecutors meticulously presented the devastating forensic linkages in court, successfully securing consecutive first-degree murder convictions that systematically completely dismantled any remaining defensive attempts to characterize the DNA matches as mere coincidences. For his catastrophic crimes against the community, Lee was officially sentenced to death by lethal injection, a judicial mandate that permanently removed him from the society he had so thoroughly terrorized and structurally fractured. He was transferred to the maximum security confines of the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, where he spent his remaining years confined to death row, firmly isolated from the open roads and vibrant communities he had previously exploited. The terrifying legacy of his crimes permanently altered the law enforcement landscape in Louisiana, forcing a massive, critical re-evaluation of how criminal profiling is applied and definitively highlighting the absolute supremacy of objective forensic data over theoretical psychology. Ultimately, Lee never faced the executioner's needle, as he died from natural causes related to heart disease while receiving emergency medical treatment in a hospital outside the prison walls in January 2016. While his death technically closed the administrative chapter on his horrific tenure, the deep psychological scars inflicted upon the victims' families and the broader community remained a permanent fixture in the cultural memory of South Louisiana. His absence from the streets finally allowed the citizens of Baton Rouge and Lafayette to reclaim their daily routines. Though the innocence of the region was permanently shattered, the files concerning his apprehension now serve as a permanent warning to law enforcement about the catastrophic dangers of tunnel vision during a multi-agency manhunt. The sobering reality of his apprehension stood as a testament to the fact that even the most mobile, seemingly invisible predators leave behind biological signatures that can eventually be weaponized against them by diligent investigators. However, the overarching terror of a charming stranger manipulating the vulnerable on the open road is not a modern phenomenon localized to the southern states, but rather a deeply entrenched American nightmare. Decades earlier, this precise brand of vehicular predation was perfected on entirely different coastlines, where the trusting atmosphere of 1970s college campuses provided an impossibly fertile hunting ground for a man who forever changed the nation's perception of a helpful ride. During the early and mid-1970s, the sprawling university campuses of the American West were bathed in an atmosphere of profound communal trust and progressive social liberation. Hitchhiking was not merely a last resort for the desperate or the marginalized, it was a widely accepted, deeply ingrained mode of transportation utilized daily by thousands of young, educated students navigating their academic and social lives. Young women with books clutched to their chests routinely lined the thoroughfares of college towns in Washington, Utah, and Colorado, confident that extending a thumb would reliably secure a safe, friendly ride to their dormitories or local ski resorts. This cultural phenomenon relied heavily on an unspoken generational pact, an inherent belief that the peers and locals sharing these picturesque academic enclaves were inherently benign and mutually protective. Law enforcement agencies of the era viewed hitchhiking as a minor traffic nuisance rather than a high-risk activity, possessing no conceptual framework for the emerging reality of a highly mobile, geographically unrestrained serial predator. The cultural landscape was completely devoid of the cynical vigilance that would characterize later decades, leaving these vibrant communities uniquely vulnerable to an offender who could weaponize their inherent altruism. A smartly dressed, articulate young man driving a compact vehicle was universally perceived as a helpful citizen rather than a mortal threat, a fatal miscalculation that allowed a monster to operate in plain sight. This deeply entrenched culture of casual trust effectively served as an expansive, unmonitored hunting ground for a law student who meticulously studied the behavioral vulnerabilities of his peers. He possessed an acute understanding of social dynamics, recognizing that a polite smile and a manufactured vulnerability could instantly bypass the minimal defensive instincts of his thoroughly unsuspecting targets. The absolute innocence of the era provided the perfect camouflage for an apex predator, who would soon shatter the illusion of safety on college campuses forever, turning the simple act of asking for a ride into a deadly game of chance. The devastating collapse of this carefree collegiate atmosphere began abruptly when an alarming succession of young, vibrant women started vanishing completely without a trace from the immediate vicinity of their universities and local recreational areas. The sheer brazenness of these abductions reached a terrifying zenith on a crowded summer day at Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington, where thousands of sunbathers inadvertently served as an audience to a meticulously orchestrated double kidnapping. Witnesses eventually recalled encountering a handsome, articulate man who introduced himself simply as Ted, a charismatic stranger who strategically wore his arm in a sling or hobbled on crutches while struggling to carry heavy items or a sailboat mast. By explicitly appealing to the compassionate nature of his targets, this seemingly disabled individual successfully lured multiple women away from the safety of the crowds and toward his tan Volkswagen Beetle, exploiting their natural inclination to assist a struggling peer. Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, two completely unassociated women enjoying the state park on that identical afternoon, both agreed to help the charming stranger, only to permanently disappear into the dense foliage surrounding the parking lot. When their skeletal remains were later discovered heavily scavenged by animals in a remote wooded area, the chilling reality of a highly organized, socially adept serial killer operating in broad daylight was definitively confirmed. The discovery established a terrifying modus operandi that completely defied traditional criminal profiles, proving that the predator was not a lurking, socially inept outcast, but rather a confident, attractive man who could effortlessly navigate crowded public spaces. Panic rapidly permeated the previously relaxed university towns as authorities issued desperate warnings regarding a charismatic young man driving a distinctive, light-colored imported car. The sheer audacity of kidnapping two women from a heavily populated public park within mere hours of each other indicated an escalating compulsion and an absolute confidence in his ability to manipulate human empathy. This catastrophic escalation marked the definitive end of an era, forcing young women to view every request for assistance, no matter how benign, with profound suspicion and immediate dread. As the chilling pattern of disappearances rapidly expanded across state lines, stretching from the dense forests of Washington to the mountainous terrains of Utah and Colorado, the ensuing investigation devolved into a chaotic matrix of fragmented jurisdictions. Local police departments, operating entirely without the benefit of centralized databases or rapid communication networks, struggled intensely to connect the disparate missing persons reports that were accumulating in their respective files. The elusive predator leveraged this systemic lack of interagency coordination to his absolute advantage, continuously shifting his hunting grounds to evade the localized dragnets that inevitably followed each discovery of scattered remains. Despite his meticulous efforts to destroy physical evidence at his rural dump sites, a crucial investigative breakthrough occurred when a surviving victim named Carol Duranch managed to fiercely fight her way out of his vehicle, providing detectives with a detailed description of his face and his ubiquitous Volkswagen Beetle. This harrowing escape, combined with increasing witness testimonies corroborating the suspect's vehicle and physical description, eventually led to the 1975 traffic stop and subsequent arrest of former law student Ted Bundy. However, the apprehension of this highly intelligent, deceptively articulate suspect did not conclude the terror, but rather initiated a bizarre and incredibly frustrating legal odyssey characterized by catastrophic security failures. Bundy, aggressively utilizing his legal background to represent himself in court, successfully manipulated the judicial system and incredibly managed to execute two separate, audacious escapes from heavily fortified county jails in Colorado. During his second, vastly more successful flight from the Garfield County Jail, he vanished into the unforgiving winter landscape, triggering an absolutely massive, nationwide manhunt while the authorities faced intense public humiliation. The terrifying realization that America's most prolific suspected serial killer was actively roaming the country without any constraints sent shockwaves through the national consciousness, paralyzing communities and severely exposing the critical vulnerabilities of the criminal justice system. While federal agents scoured the western states, the fugitive completely reinvented his methodology, quietly making his way to the southeastern coastline, where an entirely new population of unsuspecting students awaited. The unprecedented national manhunt reached its horrific, violent culmination in January 1978, when the fugitive violently shattered the tranquility of the Florida State University campus in Tallahassee. In an absolute frenzy of unrestrained rage that drastically deviated from his previously calculated, stealthy modus operandi, Bundy infiltrated the Chi Omega sorority house under the cover of darkness, brutally attacking 4 sleeping women with a piece of firewood and leaving 2 dead. This chaotic, Savage assault within a densely populated student residence yielded an abundance of critical forensic evidence that the killer, in his panicked haste, had previously managed to avoid leaving behind at his outdoor crime scenes. The most damning and unalterable piece of evidence was a vicious, distinct bite mark left on the body of victim Lisa Levy, a brutal signature that forensic odontologists would later meticulously preserve and analyze. Following a subsequent, equally violent attack on another student blocks away, Bundy fled Tallahassee in a stolen vehicle, leading to a fateful encounter with a lone patrol officer in Pensacola, Florida, in February 1978. After a desperate, physical struggle on the side of a darkened road, the officer successfully subdued the vagrant, completely unaware at that exact moment that he had just captured the most hunted fugitive in American history. The dramatic climax of the multi-year investigation shifted from the physical pursuit to the sterile environment of the courtroom, where pioneering forensic dentistry took center stage in a highly televised legal spectacle. Experts definitively matched the unique, staggered impressions of Bundy's crooked teeth directly to the horrific bite mark left on Levy, providing the undeniable physical linkage that prosecutors desperately needed to secure a conviction. This groundbreaking application of forensic science systematically dismantled Bundy's carefully constructed facade of innocent charm, exposing the profound brutality that lurked beneath his articulate, educated exterior. The absolute irrefutability of the physical evidence finally silenced the killer's manipulative grandstanding, officially concluding one of the most terrifying, expansive predatory campaigns ever recorded in modern criminal history. Following a highly publicized, deeply chaotic trial in which the defendant continually attempted to manipulate the judicial proceedings, Ted Bundy was definitively convicted and subsequently sentenced to death by the state of Florida. Despite spending a decade desperately exhausting every available legal appeal and attempting to barter for his life by offering to locate the remains of dozens of unfound victims, his execution was finally mandated. On January 24, 1989, Bundy was put to death via the electric chair at the Florida State Prison, an event that drew large crowds of revelers outside the prison walls, reflecting the immense public trauma his crimes had inflicted. The catastrophic legacy of his multi-state rampage fundamentally and permanently eradicated the cultural acceptance of hitchhiking across the United States, replacing the innocent communal trust of the 1970s with a profound, enduring paranoia regarding strangers. Law enforcement agencies were forced to completely revolutionize their inter-jurisdictional communication protocols, leading directly to the establishment of centralized national databases designed specifically to track mobile, repetitive offenders. The surviving families of the victims, while granted a measure of ultimate judicial closure, were left to navigate the permanent void created by a man who had casually extinguished the lives of some of the brightest young women of their generation. Bundy's extensive psychological evaluations and subsequent death row confessions became foundational texts for the emerging field of behavioral science, providing invaluable, albeit grim, insights into the structural pathology of psychopathy, the chilling realization that true evil could successfully masquerade as a helpful, attractive peer forever altered the American psychological landscape. Yet, even as the nation collectively sighed in relief at the demise of its most infamous predator, the vast, transient networks of the country's highways continued to harbor deeply isolated mysteries. While some victims were snatched from crowded campuses, others were tragically lost in the desolate, dusty expanses of the American South, where an entirely nameless girl was about to embark a fatal journey into the unknown. In the late 1970s, the culture surrounding the American highway system was fundamentally different, existing in an era where the immense, desolate stretches of interstate asphalt provided both a perceived escape route and a lethal trap for thousands of disenfranchised drifters. The transient lifestyle was embraced by many seeking independence or fleeing domestic hardship, heavily relying on the completely unregulated, informal network of long-haul truckers and traveling salesmen for necessary transportation across state lines. In this vast, unforgiving environment, young people frequently stood on the dusty shoulders of Texas highways, raising a thumb in a silent plea for forward momentum. Completely untethered from the safety nets of their hometowns, Deborah Jackson, a 23-year-old woman originally from Abilene, Texas, was one such traveler who frequently navigated this transient, high-risk existence during the fall of 1979. Having left her family home earlier that year, she became part of an invisible, highly transient population that routinely moved between temporary jobs and cheap motels, effectively dropping off the radar of traditional society. For women like Deborah, the open road offered a profound sense of anonymity, but that exact same invisibility made them exceptionally vulnerable to predatory motorists who viewed the desolate stretches of asphalt as a consequence, free hunting ground. Operating without mobile phones, GPS tracking, or reliable, consistent communication with concerned relatives, these hitchhikers surrendered their personal safety entirely to the whims of the absolute strangers who unlocked their passenger doors. The expansive, sun-baked highways of Texas stretched for hundreds of miles between populated centers, creating vast geographical voids where a physical struggle could go entirely unseen and a sudden disappearance could go completely unnoticed for decades. The inherent danger of this nomadic lifestyle was a widely acknowledged, but routinely ignored reality for those who simply could not afford commercial bus fare, cementing a fatalistic reliance on the questionable kindness of passing vehicles. Ultimately, Deborah's journey along the Interstate 35 corridor would tragically intersect with a driver who weaponized the vast emptiness of the Texas landscape, transforming a routine highway pickup into a permanent, decades-long forensic mystery. The grim, unforgiving reality of the transient highway culture materialized in the most horrific manner on the morning of Halloween in 1979, when the lifeless body of an unidentified young woman was discovered in a concrete culvert near Georgetown, Texas. A local motorist, casually scanning the desolate rural landscape while traveling along Interstate 35, spotted the remains discarded brutally over a guardrail, initiating a massive law enforcement response to the completely isolated stretch of road. Arriving investigators encountered a profoundly chilling crime scene, discovering a female victim who had been violently sexually assaulted and subsequently strangled to death before being callously dumped in the shallow drainage ditch. In a deliberate, deeply unsettling effort to humiliate the victim and severely hinder future identification efforts, the perpetrator had completely stripped the young woman of her clothing, leaving her wearing absolutely nothing except a single pair of bright orange socks. This highly distinctive, bizarre detail immediately became the defining characteristic of the horrific crime, permanently branding the anonymous victim in the official files of the Williamson County Sheriff's Office as simply Orange Socks. Detectives meticulously scoured the surrounding brush and highway embankments for any trace of her missing garments, identification cards, or personal belongings, but the killer had methodically sanitized the area, ensuring she remained a complete cipher. The local medical examiner determined that she had been murdered mere hours before her discovery, indicating that she had likely been picked up by a motorist somewhere along the interstate corridor during the darkness of the preceding night. Despite extensive media coverage, the widespread distribution of forensic sketches across the state, and frantic inquiries sent to missing persons bureaus nationwide, nobody stepped forward to claim the young woman with the distinctive garments. The complete absence of identifying documentation and the fundamentally transient nature of the interstate highway system immediately and severely handicapped the investigation, as authorities possessed absolutely zero context regarding where she had initiated her fatal journey or who might have been actively searching for her. This devastating realization solidified the case as a textbook example of vehicular predation, where the victim's structural anonymity was heavily weaponized by the killer to ensure his own permanent escape from traditional justice. As the months turned into agonizing years, the investigation into the brutal murder of Orange Socks devolved into a chaotic, profoundly frustrating sequence of false leads and devastating dead ends that severely tested the absolute limits of local law enforcement. In 1982, the case took a massive, heavily publicized detour when notorious serial confessor Henry Lee Lucas, an immensely manipulative drifter already in custody for multiple homicides, eagerly claimed responsibility for the Georgetown murder. Lucas, who infamously confessed to hundreds of completely unsolved killings across the United States in exchange for improved prison conditions and the attention of captivated Texas Rangers, provided specific, unverified details about picking the victim up and strangling her. Based heavily on his enthusiastic but highly inconsistent testimony, local prosecutors successfully tried and convicted Lucas for the murder in 1984, securing a formal death sentence that seemingly closed the books on the notorious cold case. However, this judicial victory was built on a profoundly unstable foundation of manufactured lies, and the conviction began to spectacularly unravel when independent journalistic investigations and forensic reviews systematically dismantled Lucas's completely impossible geographic timeline. Extensive employment records and undeniable witness testimonies conclusively proved that Lucas was actually working in Jacksonville, Florida, on the precise day the young woman was murdered in Texas, rendering his entire confession a catastrophic fabrication. Despite the overwhelming evidence of his innocence in this specific crime, which eventually prompted the governor of Texas to commute his death sentence to life imprisonment, the immense damage to the investigation had already been irrevocably done. The heavy reliance on Lucas's false confession had squandered crucial years of investigative momentum, allowing the actual perpetrator to vanish completely while the physical evidence remained entirely stagnant within the dark archives of the Williamson County Sheriff's Office. Following the total collapse of the Lucas prosecution, the case of Orange Socks plummeted back into total obscurity, severely compounded by the tragic reality that she remained entirely nameless, buried in a pauper's grave under a headstone simply marked, "Unidentified Woman." Successive generations of detectives meticulously reviewed the deteriorating case files, desperately attempting to extract new leads from the preserved biological evidence. But the severe scientific limitations of 20th century forensic technology continuously walled them off from the ultimate truth. The seemingly impenetrable shroud of anonymity surrounding the tragic victim was finally and completely shattered in 2019, exactly 4 decades after her battered body was unceremoniously discarded along the shoulder of Interstate 35. A highly dedicated team of cold case investigators, refusing to let the victim remain a nameless footnote in criminal history, officially partnered with the DNA Doe Project, a pioneering volunteer organization specializing in the advanced application of investigative genetic genealogy, utilizing incredibly small, heavily degraded biological samples that had been meticulously preserved by the medical examiner's office since 1979. Laboratory technicians managed to successfully extract a viable, comprehensive DNA profile of the unidentified woman. This microscopic biological signature was subsequently uploaded into massive, open-source genealogical databases, allowing specialized genetic researchers to meticulously construct an expansive family tree by tracing distant familial matches through generations of census records and birth certificates. The painstaking, mathematically complex process of triangulating distant cousins eventually guided the research team directly to a specific family lineage originating in the Abilene area, effectively narrowing the massive search parameters down to a single household. Investigators made direct contact with the surviving members of this family, delicately inquiring about any female relatives who had vanished under mysterious circumstances during the late 1970s, prompting the family to recount the heartbreaking disappearance of their sister. A subsequent, definitive DNA test conducted on a surviving sibling provided a flawless, mathematically insurmountable genetic match, conclusively proving that the woman known exclusively as Orange Socks for 40 years was, in fact, 23-year-old Deborah Jackson. This monumental, scientifically driven revelation instantly restored the humanity and identity of a victim who had been fundamentally defined by her brutalization, offering an unprecedented emotional breakthrough for detectives who had carried the burden of her case for their entire careers. The clinical, indisputable precision of genetic genealogy completely bypassed the decades of lost evidence, false confessions, and faded memories, demonstrating that even the most deeply buried secrets of the open road could be meticulously excavated by modern science. With the absolute confirmation of her identity, local authorities officially amended her death certificate, and finally updated her grave marker, permanently erasing the dehumanizing moniker that had defined her public legacy for 4 agonizing decades. While the restoration of Deborah Jackson's name provided profound, long overdue emotional closure for her grieving relatives, the investigative reality of her actual murder remains a stark, unresolved testament to the permanent dangers of the transient lifestyle. The Williamson County Sheriff's Office immediately pivoted their investigative focus toward tracing her final known movements in 1979, attempting to meticulously reconstruct her social circle and the exact circumstances that led her to hitchhike along Interstate 35. Despite this renewed, highly publicized effort to solicit fresh tips from the public based on her true identity, the individual who actually strangled her and discarded her remains continues to entirely evade law enforcement apprehension. The complete debunking of Henry Lee Lucas's involvement means that a highly dangerous, violent predator successfully utilized the anonymity of the American highway system to commit a perfect crime, shielded by the sheer geographic vastness of the state of Texas. Deborah's case stands today strictly as a partially solved mystery. The forensic science triumphed completely in reclaiming her name, but the immense passage of time has severely eroded the possibility of bringing her executioner to a court of law. Her story serves as a permanent, deeply sobering historical record of the extreme vulnerability faced by transient individuals who relied heavily on the unregulated charity of strangers to navigate the massive, unforgiving expanses of the country. As detectives continue to carefully sift through the heavily fragmented timelines of her final days, hoping for a microscopic clue that might finally identify her killer, the broader narrative of highway tragedies inevitably forces us to look toward entirely different topographies. Far away from the sun-baked concrete of the southern interstates, the damp, towering pine forests of the Pacific Northwest were actively concealing their own brutal secrets, where another completely innocent couple seeking a simple ride was about to vanish into the dense, unforgiving wilderness. In the damp, fading twilight of November 1987, the sprawling, evergreen-lined highways of the Pacific Northwest offered a breathtakingly scenic yet inherently isolated backdrop for a young Canadian couple embarking on a seemingly routine cross-border excursion. 20-year-old Jay Cook and his 18-year-old high school sweetheart, Tanya Van Kylenborg, resided in the quiet, tight-knit community of Saanich, British Columbia, where violent crime was virtually non-existent and neighbors maintained a profound sense of communal trust. Seeking a brief adventure, the couple volunteered to complete a mundane errand for Jay's father, planning a simple overnight road trip down to Seattle, Washington, to purchase specialized furnace parts for the family business. Their chosen vessel for this journey was a heavily utilized, bronze 1977 Ford Club wagon van, a spacious vehicle that perfectly accommodated their youthful, carefree lifestyle and provided a mobile sanctuary against the biting autumn cold. On November 18, they boarded the Black Ball Ferry in Victoria, crossing the choppy waters of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, before disembarking in the port town of Port Angeles to begin the driving leg of their trip along Highway 101. The couple represented the quintessential innocence of the era, completely devoid of the hyper-vigilance that would later define modern travel, trusting implicitly that the open roads of Washington state were as safe as their own Canadian neighborhoods. As they navigated the winding, mist-shrouded coastal routes, they frequently stopped to purchase snacks and fuel, leaving behind a completely unremarkable trail of receipts that documented their cheerful, unhurried progress southward. However, the dense, imposing forests flanking the highway concealed a vast, unregulated network of transient movement, where individuals with profoundly dark intentions could seamlessly blend into the steady stream of interstate traffic. Sometime during the darkest hours of their journey, their path tragically intersected with a predator who leveraged the isolation of the road to intercept their vehicle, transforming their comfortable van into a mobile trap. The young couple, who had set out with nothing but optimism and a simple map, were entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality that they were driving directly into a fatal ambush that would permanently extinguish their futures. the sprawling wilderness of Washington, which had initially drawn them in with its natural beauty, was about to become the silent, uncaring witness to one of the most baffling and brutal double homicides in the state's history. The carefree illusion of their road trip evaporated rapidly when November 19 passed without any communication from the couple, prompting their increasingly frantic families in Canada to initiate widespread, desperate inquiries with regional law enforcement agencies. The devastating confirmation that their journey had been violently intercepted materialized on November 24, when a passing motorist discovered Tanya's partially clothed, brutally battered body discarded in a rural water-logged ditch in Skagit County, miles away from their intended route. Forensic examiners arriving at the desolate crime scene grimly determined that the 18-year-old had been subjected to a horrifying sexual assault before being executed with a single, close-range gunshot to the back of the head. The terror escalated significantly the following day when authorities located the couple's bronze Ford van abandoned in a commercial parking lot in Bellingham, discovering a chilling cache of evidence inside that included surgical gloves, plastic zip ties, and half-empty boxes of ammunition. A suffocating dread settled over the investigation as law enforcement agencies across multiple counties desperately scoured the region for any sign of Jay, hoping against all odds that the young man had somehow survived the catastrophic encounter. Those fragile hopes were permanently extinguished on November 26, when a completely unrelated search party discovered Jay's lifeless body concealed beneath a bridge near the town of Monroe in Snohomish County, effectively bringing the agonizing search to a tragic conclusion. The autopsy reports revealed a staggering level of physical brutality, confirming that Jay had been fiercely beaten with rocks and subsequently strangled to death with a combination of twine and 2 red dog collars that did not belong to the victims. Detectives were immediately confronted with a logistical nightmare, as the bodies in the vehicle were scattered across 3 entirely different, widely separated counties, indicating that the killer possessed an intimate logistical knowledge of the region's secondary roads and rural dumping grounds. The sheer geographic spread of the crime scenes suggested a highly organized, mobile predator who had methodically dismantled the couple's lives over a period of hours, driving their own van between locations to actively confuse the impending police investigation. This sudden, violent eradication of 2 completely innocent young people completely shattered the perceived safety of the Pacific Northwest highway system, forcing the public to realize that a ruthless, calculating murderer was freely roaming the interstate corridors. In the immediate aftermath of the grim discoveries, a massive, multi-jurisdictional task force was hastily assembled, bringing together seasoned detectives from Skagit, Snohomish, and Whatcom counties in a desperate bid to pool their fragmented evidence. Investigators meticulously processed the abandoned Ford van, painstakingly recovering a microscopic, degraded sample of semen from Tanya's clothing, which they carefully preserved in deep, freeze evidence lockers, trusting that future scientific advancements might eventually render it useful. For over 3 agonizing decades, law enforcement poured immense resources into the investigation, tracking down hundreds of potential suspects, interviewing transient individuals who frequented the ferry terminals, and officially investigating over 300 distinct persons of interest. Despite widespread media coverage and the relentless, heartbroken advocacy of the victims' families, every promising lead inevitably dissolved into a frustrating dead end, leaving the detectives chasing phantoms across the vast Washington wilderness. The investigative files grew into mountains of cardboard boxes, documenting years of exhaustive physical searches, completely debunked theories, and thousands of hours of surveillance that ultimately failed to produce a single viable suspect who could be definitively linked to the crime scenes. As the years steadily progressed into the new millennium, the advancement of short tandem repeat DNA profiling allowed authorities to finally extract a complete genetic sequence from the preserved biological evidence, which was subsequently uploaded to the FBI's National CODIS database. However, the anticipated breakthrough failed to materialize, as the killer's genetic profile generated absolutely 0 matches within the massive federal system. conclusively proving that the perpetrator had managed to entirely avoid any subsequent felony arrests that would have legally mandated a DNA swab. The chilling realization that an individual capable of such extreme, calculated violence was living completely undetected among the general population cast a long, oppressive shadow over the aging detectives who refused to let the case entirely fade into obscurity. The investigation officially transitioned into a cold case, heavily relying on the slim hope that the killer might one day make a catastrophic error, while the victims' families were forced to navigate decades of birthdays and anniversaries enveloped in a profound, unresolved grief. The biological evidence remained silently dormant in the climate-controlled vaults of the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory, serving as a patient, microscopic witness, waiting for a technological revolution powerful enough to bypass the limitations of traditional police work. The impenetrable wall surrounding the 31-year-old mystery completely collapsed in 2018, when the Snohomish County Cold Case Unit made the visionary decision to partner with Parabon Nanolabs, a specialized firm pioneering the incredibly complex field of forensic genetic genealogy. Utilizing the thoroughly preserved biological samples extracted from the 1987 crime scene, scientists successfully generated a highly detailed DNA profile that was subsequently uploaded to GeneMatch, a public, open-source genealogical database utilized primarily by amateur family historians. A dedicated genetic genealogist meticulously constructed an expansive, highly complex family tree by triangulating distant genetic cousins, navigating through generations of census records, birth certificates, and marriage licenses to gradually narrow the massive pool of potential suspects. This mathematically rigorous, painstaking process ultimately guided the investigative team directly to a specific family lineage, isolating a single male descendant who had lived just miles away from the bridge where Jay Cook's body was discarded. The scientific spotlight suddenly illuminated William Earl Talbot Tall, a 55-year-old commercial truck driver who had lived an entirely unremarkable, quiet life, possessing absolutely no criminal record that would have historically placed him on the radar of local law enforcement. Armed with this explosive genealogical lead, detectives initiated a highly secretive, high-stakes surveillance operation, discreetly trailing Talbot as he navigated his daily routine, desperately waiting for him to discard an item containing his biological material. The critical moment of vulnerability arrived on a busy Seattle street when Talbot casually tossed a used paper coffee cup out of his truck window, unknowingly providing the heavily armed task force with the exact physical evidence they required to end his decades of freedom. Forensic technicians at the state laboratory rapidly processed the discarded cup, conducting a direct, one-to-one genetic comparison that yielded a flawless, statistically insurmountable match to the degraded semen recovered from Tanya's clothing in 1987. On May 17, 2018, heavily armed tactical units flawlessly executed a high-risk traffic stop, pulling the commercial truck over and taking the deeply shot, utterly unassuming driver into immediate custody without a single shot being fired. The stunning arrest marked a monumental, unprecedented milestone in criminal justice history, as the apprehension definitively proved that even the most meticulously concealed predators could be entirely unmasked by the undeniable, microscopic code hidden within their own bloodline. The subsequent judicial proceedings in 2019 represented a watershed moment in legal history, as William Talbot Sickon officially became the first individual in the world to be convicted of murder strictly based on evidence originally generated through investigative genetic genealogy. During the highly publicized, emotionally charged trial, prosecutors systematically dismantled the defense's desperate attempts to characterize the physical evidence as circumstantial, presenting the jury with an insurmountable mountain of clinical, undeniable biological facts. The jury delivered a definitive guilty verdict for 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, leading the presiding judge to hand down 2 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole, ensuring Talbot would permanently perish within the sterile confines of the state penitentiary. For the aging parents and siblings of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg, the historic conviction provided an immense, profound measure of definitive closure, finally terminating an agonizing 1-year nightmare of unanswered questions and relentless grief. The monumental success of the investigation firmly established genetic genealogy as the most powerful forensic tool developed since the inception of DNA profiling, rapidly accelerating the resolution of hundreds of dormant cold cases across the global law enforcement community. Talbot's complete inability to outrun his own biology served as a stark, permanent warning to violent offenders nationwide, definitively proving that the passage of time and the absence of a criminal record are no longer sufficient shields against modern scientific scrutiny. The devastating tragedy of the young Canadian couple remains a grim, enduring testament to the catastrophic vulnerabilities inherent in highway travel, where brief, seemingly innocuous interactions with strangers can instantly escalate into irreversible, terminal nightmares. Law enforcement behavioral analysts continue to study the case files to understand the profound dichotomy of a man who brutally annihilated 2 innocent lives and subsequently returned to a perfectly mundane existence, effortlessly hiding his monstrous true nature behind a quiet, blue-collar facade. The terrifying reality that a highly organized, lethal predator can seamlessly blend into the fabric of a peaceful community, completely evading suspicion while actively hunting the vulnerable, is a psychological horror that extends far beyond the borders of Washington state. This chilling capability to mask profound sadism behind a friendly, disarming exterior was arguably perfected further down the coastline in California, where a towering, incredibly intelligent killer utilized his affable personality to systematically lure innocent college students into the passenger seat of his vehicle. In the early 1970s, the coastal city of Santa Cruz, California, was experiencing a profound cultural shift as it transformed from a quiet retirement community into a bustling hub of progressive collegiate life. The newly established campus of the University of California, Santa Cruz, was intentionally deeply integrated into the sprawling redwood forests, creating a picturesque but geographically fragmented academic environment that presented severe logistical challenges for its student body. Because public transportation infrastructure was vastly inadequate for the rapid influx of young adults, a highly active, socially sanctioned culture of hitchhiking organically developed along the winding mountain roads and scenic coastal highways. Young women carrying heavy textbooks routinely lined the thoroughfares, trusting implicitly that their fellow students or the laid-back local residents would willingly offer them a safe, brief commute to their dormitories or downtown apartments. This deeply entrenched social norm created a completely unobstructed, target-rich environment for an exceptionally intelligent, highly organized predator who fully understood how to weaponize his own disarming demeanor against the inherent trust of his peers. For a towering, deeply disturbed individual named Edmund Kemper, this vibrant collegiate atmosphere provided an endless, rotating supply of vulnerable targets who actively solicited rides from strangers on a daily basis. Standing 6 feet 9 inches tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds, Kemper deliberately offset his massive, physically intimidating stature by presenting himself as an articulate, soft-spoken, and exceptionally polite young man who eagerly offered assistance to stranded pedestrians. Kemper meticulously customized his Ford Galaxy with official-looking campus parking stickers and routinely engaged in friendly conversations with local law enforcement officers, flawlessly constructing a public facade of absolute, unimpeachable civic responsibility. He recognized that a well-dressed, well-spoken driver operating a clean, ordinary vehicle would instantly bypass the defensive instincts of young women who were primarily cautious of disheveled vagrants or erratic motorists. Underneath this carefully curated mask of intellectual charm and neighborly goodwill, Kemper harbored catastrophic, deeply violent compulsions that were about to permanently violently eradicate the utopian, carefree atmosphere of the California coastline. The inherent vulnerability of the collegiate hitchhiking culture was brutally exposed and permanently shattered in May 1972, initiating a sequence of horrific events that would eventually earn the city the grim moniker of the murder capital of the world. 18-year-old Fresno State University students Mary Ann Pess and Anita Lucchesa, who were visiting the Bay Area, and attempting to navigate the confusing regional highway system, decided to hitchhike from Berkeley down toward the Stanford University area. The two young women, exhausted from traveling and eager to reach their destination, confidently accepted a ride from Kemper, who had specifically ventured out onto the major thoroughfares that afternoon with the distinct, premeditated intention of hunting. When Kemper pulled his vehicle over and cordially invited them inside, his articulate vocabulary and calm demeanor completely obscured his true intentions, prompting the girls to willingly enter the passenger compartment without a moment of hesitation. The terrible reality of their situation only became apparent when Kemper suddenly bypassed their requested exit, deliberately steering his large vehicle toward a deeply isolated, wooded area in Alameda County while simultaneously locking the passenger doors to prevent any physical escape. By the time the bewildered young women realized that their friendly driver was actually a highly organized predator executing a meticulously planned abduction, they were completely trapped within the confines of a moving, soundproofed steel cage. The sudden, completely unexplained disappearance of both Pes and Lucchesa triggered immediate alarm among their respective families, who frantically contacted multiple police departments across the state when the girls failed to return from their weekend excursion. Local law enforcement agencies, severely hindered by a total lack of physical evidence or reliable witness sightings, were initially forced to treat the case as a routine missing persons inquiry, possessing absolutely no indication that a double homicide had just occurred. Families plastered the university campuses and surrounding towns with thousands of desperate missing posters, but the terrifying reality was that the victims had already been entirely erased from the public sphere by an assailant who operated with clinical, devastating precision. This initial, successful strike firmly established a horrific operational template for the killer, providing him with the dark confidence to repeatedly exploit the local roadways while the authorities remained utterly oblivious to the magnitude of the threat. As the months progressed, the coastal community was plunged into a state of absolute, paralyzing terror as Kemper systematically accelerated his brutal campaign, successfully abducting and murdering Aiko Q, Cindy Schall, Rosalind Thorpe, and Alice Liu directly from the local transportation corridors. The sheer audacity of his operation was magnified by his incredibly risky post-crime behaviors, which included dismembering his victims and brazenly transporting their remains in the trunk of his vehicle, directly through heavy city traffic and police checkpoints. In a display of profound, terrifying psychological manipulation, Kemper actively inserted himself into the very core of the police investigation, becoming a beloved regular patron at the jury room, a local bar heavily frequented by Santa Cruz detectives and patrol officers. While the highly stressed investigators openly discussed their completely dead end theories regarding the elusive code killer over evening drinks, they were unknowingly sharing crucial tactical information directly with the exact man they were desperately attempting to apprehend. Kemper, whom the officers affectionately nicknamed Big Ed, utilized these informal barroom conversations to meticulously monitor the progress of the manhunt, simultaneously adjusting his disposal methods and hunting routes based entirely on the inside information he casually absorbed. He even went so far as to install a police frequency scanner in his own apartment and place a supportive law enforcement decal on his bumper, creating an almost impenetrable psychological blind spot that completely shielded him from any official suspicion. Despite the massive, highly publicized police presence and frantic community warnings advising women to completely cease hitchhiking, Kemper continued to successfully lure victims into his vehicle, proving that his manipulative charm was vastly more effective than widespread public paranoia. The investigation devolved into a desperate, agonizing crawl as authorities continually discovered heavily mutilated remains discarded in remote ravines and coastal access points, entirely unable to connect the seemingly random victims to a single, localized perpetrator. The community was gripped by a suffocating, pervasive dread, realizing that the killer was not a chaotic transient passing through the state, but rather a highly disciplined, invisible resident who intimately understood the terrain and the habits of his prey. The catastrophic failure of law enforcement to profile the true nature of their adversary allowed Kemper to escalate his violence to unprecedented, deeply personal levels, ultimately redirecting his terrifying focus entirely away from the anonymous roadways. The horrifying climax of the investigation materialized in April 1973, when Kemper completely abandoned his established pattern of hunting unknown collegiate hitchhikers and executed a devastatingly violent, deeply psychological strike against his ultimate target, his own mother, Clarnell Strandberg. After brutally murdering her in her sleep and subsequently killing her close friend Sarah Hollett to eliminate any potential witnesses, Kemper recognized that the discovery of their bodies would inevitably and immediately permanently destroy his carefully constructed facade. Anticipating an absolutely massive, overwhelming police response and a heavily armed statewide dragnet, Kemper fled the state of California entirely, driving continuously for hundreds of miles until he reached a desolate public telephone booth in Pueblo, Colorado. However, in a completely bizarre, thoroughly unanticipated twist that defied every established convention of criminal investigations, the expected manhunt had not actually materialized because the Santa Cruz police had not yet discovered the fresh crime scene inside his apartment. Standing in the isolated Colorado phone booth, Kemper placed a direct, unprompted toll call to the Santa Cruz Police Department, calmly identifying himself and attempting to deliver a comprehensive, meticulously detailed confession to the entire string of unsolved regional homicides. The officers receiving the call were initially completely incredulous, initially believing that the friendly, harmless Big Ed they knew from the local bar was playing an elaborate, poorly timed practical joke entirely unrelated to the horrific reality of the Code murders. Kemper was incredibly forced to aggressively insist upon his own guilt, desperately providing the officers with highly specific, entirely unreleased forensic details regarding the exact locations of concealed victim remains that only the actual perpetrator could possibly possess. Following this surreal, deeply unsettling telephone exchange, local Colorado authorities dispatched a single, highly cautious patrol vehicle to the designated phone booth, successfully taking the towering, completely compliant serial killer into custody without a single instance of physical resistance. This highly unconventional resolution completely bypassed traditional forensic breakthroughs and dramatic police pursuits, concluding one of the most terrifying predatory campaigns in California history, not through detective work, but through the spontaneous, voluntary surrender of the perpetrator himself. The absolute shockwave that rippled through the Santa Cruz law enforcement community upon his arrest fundamentally shattered their collective trust, as they realized the monster they had been hunting had been hiding completely in plain sight, buying them drinks. During the subsequent, highly publicized judicial proceedings in late 1973, Kemper provided the court with chillingly articulate, deeply analytical accounts of his crimes, maintaining a calm, objective demeanor that heavily disturbed the psychiatric evaluators and the presiding jury. Despite Kemper's own explicit, highly unusual request to receive the death penalty for his catastrophic actions, the Supreme Court's temporary suspension of capital punishment during that specific era legally restricted the judge's available sentencing parameters. Ultimately, the court imposed 8 concurrent life sentences, ensuring that Kemper would be permanently removed from society and securely incarcerated within the highly fortified walls of the California Medical Facility in Vacaville for the entirety of his natural life. While incarcerated, Kemper's profound, terrifyingly clear insight into his own dark pathology made him an incredibly valuable, unprecedented resource for the newly formed FBI Behavioral Science Unit, leading to extensive interviews that fundamentally shaped modern criminal profiling techniques. Agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler utilized Kemper's deeply analytical explanations of his own predatory methodologies to successfully map the psychological architectures of organized serial killers, transforming his horrific legacy into a foundational textbook for future generations of criminal investigators. For the coastal community of Santa Cruz, the chilling revelations of his trial permanently and irreversibly eradicated the deeply ingrained culture of collegiate hitchhiking, officially marking the definitive end of an era heavily defined by communal trust and open roads. The tragic, unresolved grief of the victims' families remains a permanent, haunting testament to the catastrophic consequences of engaging with seemingly benign strangers, entirely proving that profound evil can frequently reside behind the most articulate, polite exterior. Kemper's case stands today as a monumental, deeply unsettling warning regarding the profound limitations of human intuition, definitively demonstrating that a monstrous predator cannot always be identified by his outward appearance or his social affiliations. However, while the Pacific Northwest slowly attempted to recover its equilibrium, the suffocating, smog-choked valleys of Southern California were about to breed an entirely different kind of terror in the following decade. In a completely stark contrast to Kemper's stealthy, methodical vehicular abductions, a highly chaotic, brutally violent phantom was preparing to terrorize the sweltering streets of 1980s Los Angeles, turning both the highways and private homes into immediate slaughterhouses. In the sweltering, smog-choked expanse of Southern California during the summer of 1985, a palpable atmosphere of tension began to grip the sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles. This vast urban landscape was heavily defined by its seemingly endless network of interconnected freeways and sun-baked boulevards, creating a deeply entrenched car culture where the automobile was considered an absolute necessity for survival. Residents navigating this massive, geographically fragmented region routinely spent hours sealed within the metal confines of their vehicles, trusting implicitly that their cars provided a secure, mobile fortress against the unpredictable dangers of the city streets. Late-night commutes, long drives through isolated canyon roads, and solitary walks through dimly lit parking structures were an entirely ordinary part of the daily routine for millions of Angelenos. However, this profound reliance on vehicular mobility inadvertently created a vast, highly exposed hunting ground for a profoundly chaotic predator who utilized the anonymity of the highway system to systematically terrorize the entire state. Unlike meticulous killers who patiently waited for unsuspecting hitchhikers to solicit a ride, this new, deeply terrifying phantom actively transformed stolen automobiles into weapons of rapid infiltration and escape. The sprawling, unregulated nature of the California transit corridors allowed him to seamlessly traverse dozens of distinct law enforcement jurisdictions in a single night, effectively erasing his tracks as he moved fluidly from the suffocating heat of the San Gabriel Valley to the affluent coastal neighborhoods. Citizens who felt entirely insulated by the locked doors of their sedans and the heavy deadbolts of their homes were completely unaware that a relentlessly violent intruder was actively stalking the darkened roadways, deliberately searching for the slightest vulnerability. The sheer geographic vastness that had long fueled the Californian dream of boundless freedom was about to be aggressively weaponized, turning routine midnight drives and quiet residential streets into sudden, inescapable slaughterhouses. A deeply suffocating, unprecedented era of paranoia was preparing to descend upon the entire West Coast, fundamentally shattering the illusion that anyone was safe behind the wheel of a car or within the perceived sanctuary of their own neighborhood. The fragile illusion of urban security was abruptly and violently dismantled in the spring of 1985 when a rapid, chaotic succession of brutal attacks fundamentally paralyzed local law enforcement agencies. The sheer randomness and unprecedented ferocity of the violence initially bewildered detectives, but a terrifying pattern eventually emerged, highlighting the assailants' heavy reliance on stolen vehicles to execute rapid, devastating strikes against unsuspecting motorists and homeowners. The terror escalated dramatically when victims were violently intercepted directly inside or immediately adjacent to their automobiles, proving that the killer was actively utilizing the transit infrastructure to select and stalk his prey. In one particularly chilling instance, 30-year-old Cy Leon Yu was brutally dragged from her vehicle during a routine traffic stop in Monterey Park, executed point blank before the killer vanished into the labyrinthine street grid. Shortly after, the horrifying assault on Maria Hernandez, who was mercilessly gunned down right in her own driveway as she exited her car, underscored the terrifying reality that the perpetrator was following victims straight from the open road to their front doors. Authorities quickly realized they were not pursuing a localized, stationary threat, but rather an incredibly mobile, frenetic serial killer who rapidly stole cars to traverse massive distances, striking multiple times in a single night before discarding the vehicles like disposable tools. The deeply unsettling modus operandi involved breaking into homes, brutalizing the occupants, and frequently stealing their personal automobiles to facilitate his immediate escape to an entirely different county. This vehicular fluidity allowed the attacker, rapidly dubbed the Night Stalker by the terrified press, to completely outpace the fragmented police communications of the era, leaving a chaotic trail of blood, shattered glass, and abandoned sedans stretching from Los Angeles all the way up to the San Francisco Bay Area. The sudden realization that the killer was utilizing the very lifeblood of California, its massive roadway system, to wage a localized war against its citizens, plunged the entire state into an absolute, suffocating panic. Gun sales skyrocketed instantly, hardware stores entirely sold out of heavy deadbolts, and the previously vibrant, late night traffic of Los Angeles ground to a terrified halt as residents realized that absolutely anyone driving a beat-up, imported car could be the architect of the escalating massacre. As the sweltering summer temperatures continued to rise, the intense, multi-agency manhunt to apprehend the elusive Night Stalker devolved into a chaotic, profoundly frustrating logistical nightmare for California authorities. Detectives from dozens of disparate municipalities desperately attempted to pool their heavily fragmented evidence, tracking the dizzying array of stolen vehicles that the killer constantly abandoned in random parking lots and dusty alleyways. The sheer volume of recovered vehicles eventually provided investigators with critical, though deeply microscopic, physical evidence, as forensic technicians meticulously combed the steering wheels, gear shifts, and door handles of the discarded cars for any trace of the phantom. Crucial breakthroughs finally began to materialize when a handful of extraordinarily resilient surviving victims, who had endured unimaginable brutality, provided detailed, corroborating testimonies regarding the attacker's physical appearance and his heavily decayed dental hygiene. Based heavily on these harrowing eyewitness accounts, law enforcement artists generated a stark, terrifying composite sketch of a gaunt, intense figure with curly hair, which was immediately broadcast across every television network and plastered on every billboard in the state. The widespread publication of this menacing image induced a state of hyper-vigilance among the civilian population, resulting in emergency dispatch centers being absolutely overwhelmed with thousands of frantic, mostly erroneous sightings of suspicious vehicles and individuals. Despite the massive, unprecedented deployment of heavily armed police patrols and neighborhood watch groups monitoring the darkened streets, the predator continued to successfully bypass the surveillance networks, executing brazen attacks with absolute impunity. He actively mocked the authorities by deliberately leaving behind highly specific, satanic symbols drawn in lipstick at the crime scenes, further fueling the hysterical media narrative and deeply terrifying a population already pushed to the absolute brink. The investigation appeared hopelessly stalled in a reactive cycle, constantly arriving at the scenes of newly abandoned stolen cars hours after the killer had already moved on to his next horrific destination. However, the killer's frantic, entirely undisciplined reliance on vehicular theft was actively planting the invisible seeds of his own ultimate destruction, as he continually exposed himself to the quiet, unrelenting exactitude of modern fingerprint analysis. The chaotic, profoundly terrifying reign of the Night Stalker experienced a sudden, spectacular collapse in late August 1985, triggered entirely by a single, catastrophic error committed during a routine vehicular escape. Following a brutal, highly publicized attack in Mission Viejo, an incredibly observant teenage witness managed to meticulously record a partial license plate number from the suspicious orange Toyota station wagon the assailant used to flee the heavily guarded neighborhood. Law enforcement agencies immediately aggressively flooded the region's transit networks, successfully locating the stolen, abandoned Toyota parked in a densely populated area of Los Angeles just days later. Forensic technicians executed an incredibly thorough, microscopic examination of the entire vehicle, ultimately extracting a single, highly pristine latent fingerprint from the surface of the rearview mirror. This microscopic ridge detail was rapidly fed into the newly established, highly advanced automated fingerprint identification system, which miraculously produced an instantaneous, undeniable match to a 25-year-old drifter with a lengthy criminal record named Richard Ramirez. Armed with a definitive identity and a clear mugshot, authorities held a massive, highly publicized press conference, releasing Ramirez's photograph to the deeply terrified public and officially transforming him into the most intensely hunted fugitive in the country. Completely unaware that his face was currently dominating every newspaper and television screen in California, Ramirez casually returned to East Los Angeles via a Greyhound bus, stepping directly into an environment that was violently primed for his immediate apprehension. Upon casually entering a local convenience store and noticing his own terrifying visage staring back at him from the front page of the morning newspapers, Ramirez panicked completely and initiated a desperate, chaotic flight through the sweltering neighborhood. In a frantic, entirely uncoordinated bid to secure a rapid escape, he aggressively attempted to violently carjack multiple civilian vehicles directly on the street, drawing the immediate, furious attention of the highly vigilant local residents. In one of the most dramatic, unprecedented conclusions to a criminal manhunt in American history, an enraged mob of ordinary citizens relentlessly chased Ramirez down, violently subduing and severely beating the infamous serial killer until heavily armed police units finally arrived to officially take him into custody. The highly publicized, incredibly chaotic judicial proceedings against Richard Ramirez evolved into an absolute circus of deeply disturbing behavior. As the defiant killer continuously flashed satanic symbols at the terrified gallery and frequently disrupted the courtroom with bizarre outbursts. Despite his aggressive, highly manipulative attempts to derail the legal process, the staggering mountain of forensic evidence, heavily bolstered by undeniable survivor testimonies and the crucial fingerprint extracted from the stolen getaway vehicle, proved entirely insurmountable. In 1989, a deeply traumatized jury ultimately convicted Ramirez of 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries, resulting in the judge handing down 19 separate death sentences. Ramirez was subsequently permanently exiled to the maximum security confines of death row at San Quentin State Prison, entirely stripped of the vehicular freedom he had previously weaponized to plunge the entire state of California into total darkness. He spent decades aggressively exploiting the complex appellate system, successfully delaying his execution until he eventually succumbed to complications from B-cell lymphoma inside a heavily guarded civilian hospital in 2013. The devastating legacy of his frenetic rampage fundamentally altered the architectural security of Southern California, permanently ending the era of unlocked doors and severely amplifying the public's inherent fear of the open roadways and the strangers who travel them. Law enforcement agencies heavily studied the structural failures of the interagency communications that had allowed Ramirez to seamlessly cross municipal lines, leading to a massive, permanent overhaul of how police departments track highly mobile, vehicular predators. His capture strictly by an enraged mob of ordinary citizens stands as a profoundly rare, highly cinematic moment where the terrified public violently reclaimed their own streets from a seemingly invincible monster. While the sprawling, sun-drenched highways of California slowly recovered from the unprecedented trauma of the Night Stalker, an entirely different, vastly colder geographic environment was actively nurturing a monstrous appetite for the vulnerable. Across the country, in the freezing, heavily industrialized landscape of upstate New York, the marginalized women who desperately relied on the charity of passing drivers were about to encounter a brutal, heavily institutionalized predator patiently stalking the banks of the Genesee River. In the heavily industrialized, unforgivingly cold environment of Rochester, New York, during the late 1980s, the stark economic decline left a highly vulnerable population stranded on the absolute margins of society. The notorious Lyell Avenue corridor evolved into a bustling, desperate epicenter for sex workers, transient individuals, and impoverished women struggling with profound addiction. for these marginalized women. Stepping into the passenger seat of an unknown vehicle was not a matter of casual transportation, but rather an immediate, daily economic necessity required for basic physical survival. The brutal, freezing winter temperatures of upstate New York forced them to make rapid, deeply perilous decisions, frequently entering the cars of anonymous men just to secure a brief respite from the biting wind and snow. They operated entirely outside the traditional safety nets of suburban life, relying heavily on a fragile, unspoken street intuition to gauge the latent danger of the motorists pulling up to the curb. Unfortunately, this inherent socio-economic invisibility transformed the avenue into an ideal, heavily stocked hunting ground for an apex predator who fully understood that society routinely ignores the disappearance of those living in the shadows. The women who frequented these icy street corners were mothers, daughters, and friends who maintained desperate hopes of eventually escaping their harsh circumstances, completely unaware that a meticulously organized serial killer was actively patrolling their designated territory. A simple request for a ride, or a briefly negotiated transaction executed through a rolled-down window, suddenly became a definitive death sentence for women who possessed absolutely no structural defenses against a coordinated attack. The heavily trafficked roadways provided the perfect camouflage for an unassuming driver operating a mundane vehicle, allowing him to easily blend into the endless stream of commercial and commuter traffic traversing the region. Consequently, a suffocating, deeply entrenched vulnerability defined the nightly routine of the Lyell Avenue community, setting a tragic stage for a localized massacre that would thoroughly expose the catastrophic failures of the American criminal justice system. The grim, fatalistic reality of the Lyell Avenue ecosystem was violently ruptured in March 1988, when the deeply concerning trend of transient women vanishing without a trace officially crossed the threshold into a verified serial homicide investigation. The community's localized anxiety transformed into absolute, undeniable terror with the horrifying discovery of Dorothy Blackburn's heavily battered remains, which had been brutally discarded near the freezing, rushing waters of the Genesee River Gorge. This initial, grim recovery was rapidly followed by the unearthing of several more marginalized women from the immediate area, all of whom had been last seen alive entering unidentified vehicles along the notorious transit corridor. Law enforcement officials, initially slow to connect the missing persons reports due to the victims' highly transient lifestyles, were abruptly forced to confront the catastrophic reality that a highly active, geographically focused serial predator was operating within their jurisdiction. The medical examiner's reports revealed a chilling, completely unvarying methodology, indicating that the victims had been subjected to extreme physical violence, frequently culminating in manual strangulation or blunt force trauma, before their bodies were callously discarded in remote, heavily wooded ravines. The killer's deliberate selection of disposal sites along the desolate riverbanks and isolated industrial access roads clearly demonstrated his intimate, thoroughly calculated knowledge of the region's obscure geography. Panic began to aggressively infiltrate the previously hardened street-level networks as the surviving women realized that the very mechanism required for their financial survival, getting into strangers' cars, was actively being weaponized to systematically exterminate them. The sheer proximity and frequency of the murders indicated an assailant who operated with terrifying confidence, completely unbothered by the growing police presence and the desperate warnings circulating among the vulnerable women. This sudden, concentrated explosion of violence fundamentally shifted the investigative posture of the Rochester Police Department, triggering the mobilization of a massive, multi-agency effort designed to halt the unprecedented bloodshed occurring within the city's blind spots. The undeniable existence of the Genesee River killer cast a permanent, suffocating shadow over upstate New York, confirming that an invisible monster was successfully utilizing the city's road networks to execute a localized, incredibly vicious campaign of terror. In immediate response to the rapidly escalating victim count, local and state authorities established an unprecedented, highly coordinated task force that implemented aggressive surveillance tactics across the entire Lyell Avenue district. Undercover female police officers, heavily wired for sound and closely monitored by heavily armed tactical teams, bravely posed as sex workers and hitchhikers in a desperate, highly dangerous attempt to intercept the killer during his nightly hunts. Despite these massive logistical efforts, and the constant presence of police helicopters illuminating the dark industrial sectors with powerful searchlights, the elusive predator continued to successfully bypass the intricate security nets. The brutal winter conditions of upstate New York severely complicated the ongoing forensic investigations, heavily preserving some biological evidence while simultaneously burying massive crime scenes under feet of impenetrable snow and ice. The killer exhibited a deeply disturbing, highly risky behavioral pattern of repeatedly returning to his remote, frozen dump sites to further violate and mutilate the deceased victims, demonstrating a complete disregard for the inherent dangers of visiting active crime scenes. Investigators poured thousands of hours into meticulously analyzing the fragmented tire tracks and microscopic fibers recovered from the freezing ravines, desperately attempting to piece together the identity of an offender who left agonizingly few traditional clues behind. The community's frustration reached an absolute boiling point as the confirmed victim count surpassed a dozen women, exposing the profound difficulties associated with protecting a marginalized population that historically deeply distrusted law enforcement interventions. The task force was continually forced to chase thousands of useless, frequently malicious tips from the panicked public, diverting crucial resources away from the actual transit corridors where the killer was quietly continuing his devastating work. The predator's ability to maintain a perfectly unremarkable facade while navigating his Plymouth-Reliant through heavily patrolled areas allowed him to seamlessly interact with his targets, completely avoiding the erratic behaviors that typically draw police suspicion. As the massive, intensely scrutinized investigation dragged on into the bitter winter of 1990, the exhausted detectives heavily recognized that their only viable strategy was to physically catch the phantom in the absolute, undeniable act of revisiting his gruesome handiwork. The agonizing, multi-year investigative stalemate was dramatically shattered on a freezing afternoon in January 1990, culminating in a high-stakes, flawlessly executed covert surveillance operation centered directly over the treacherous Genesee River Gorge. A sharp-eyed police pilot operating a low-flying state police helicopter noticed a completely unremarkable vehicle parked suspiciously near a heavily secluded bridge, a remote location that had previously been identified as a highly probable disposal site. The aerial surveillance team observed a solitary male figure standing directly over what appeared to be a frozen human form, immediately prompting the pilot to aggressively radio for a massive, coordinated ground interception. Heavily armed patrol units rapidly descended upon the isolated access road, successfully executing a sudden, high-risk traffic stop and pulling over a 54-year-old, seemingly innocuous food service worker named Arthur Shawcross. Upon closer inspection, investigators quickly confirmed that Shawcross was actively fleeing from the recently discarded, heavily mutilated remains of his final victim. June Stott, effectively catching the prolific serial killer completely red-handed at his own crime scene. During the subsequent, incredibly intense marathon interrogations conducted at police headquarters, the unassuming, grandfatherly exterior of the suspect thoroughly collapsed, giving way to a chillingly detached, absolutely meticulous recounting of his horrific crimes. The most devastating, completely unfathomable plot twist of the entire investigation emerged when routine background checks conclusively revealed that Shawcross was not a first-time offender, but rather a previously convicted child murderer who had brutally killed 2 children in 1972. The sheer realization that this apex predator had been inexplicably granted early parole by the state in 1987, despite profound psychological warnings regarding his severe danger to the public, sent immediate, catastrophic shockwaves through the entire law enforcement community. Shawcross casually provided detectives with exact, undeniably accurate topographical details regarding the precise locations of previously undiscovered victims, utilizing a chillingly clinical vocabulary to describe the mechanical efficiency of his localized slaughter. The dramatic apprehension completely circumvented the need for complex, drawn-out forensic deductions, capturing the monster strictly through aggressive, real, time tactical awareness, and exposing one of the most deadly, entirely preventable institutional failures in the history of American criminal justice. The highly publicized judicial proceedings against Arthur Shawcross in the winter of 1990 quickly devolved into a deeply controversial, heavily scrutinized legal battle focused entirely on the defendant's mental competency and complex psychological history. In a desperate, highly calculated bid to entirely avoid criminal culpability, Shawcross's defense team mounted an elaborate psychiatric defense, aggressively claiming his catastrophic violence was the direct result of severe post-traumatic stress disorder from the Vietnam War and a highly unusual extra chromosome. However, leading forensic psychiatrists systematically and completely dismantled these manufactured claims in front of the jury, conclusively proving that Shawcross was actually a highly organized, deeply sadistic psychopath who fully understood the extreme criminality of his actions. The jury swiftly delivered a definitive, resounding guilty verdict, leading the presiding judge to hand down a monumental sentence of 250 years to life in state prison, officially guaranteeing the predator would permanently perish behind maximum security walls. For the grieving families of the victims and the deeply traumatized Lyell Avenue community, the massive sentence provided an absolute, undeniable measure of permanent judicial finality, definitively removing the threat from their transit corridors. Yet the profound, lingering anger over his completely unjustified 1987 parole remained a permanent, festering wound, fundamentally altering how the state of New York structurally evaluated and monitored the early release of highly violent felony offenders. Shawcross eventually died of cardiac arrest in 2008 while serving his sentence, entirely unmourned and permanently separated from the vulnerable, marginalized populations he had so casually and mercilessly exploited for years. The deeply documented files of the Genesee River Killer continue to heavily serve as a grim, cautionary textbook for behavioral analysts studying the catastrophic recidivism rates of structurally untreated, highly organized predatory psychopaths. His terrifying, highly lethal reliance on his vehicle to trap unsuspecting women firmly solidified the absolute danger of the open road, proving that an innocent request for a ride frequently leads to a deeply premeditated execution. Yet, while Shawcross weaponized his deceptive, blue-collar anonymity to lure his victims into the passenger seat, an even more terrifying dynamic was previously perfected in the suffocating humidity of 1970s Florida, where a deeply trusted predator explicitly utilized the ultimate symbol of communal safety, a police cruiser, to completely obliterate the lives of innocent hitchhikers. In the vibrant, sun-drenched landscape of South Florida during the early 1970s, a profound and deeply ingrained cultural trust existed between the civilian population and the law enforcement officers sworn to protect them. The idyllic coastal communities, characterized by sprawling beaches and endless stretches of highway, fostered a relaxed, carefree atmosphere where young people routinely engaged in hitchhiking without a second thought for their personal safety. Unlike the suspicious, hyper-vigilant societal norms that would emerge in later decades, the youth of this era viewed the open road as a relatively benign avenue for adventure, frequently accepting rides from completely anonymous motorists to navigate between beach towns and local hangouts. This inherent vulnerability was exponentially magnified when the vehicle pulling over to offer assistance was an official, fully marked police cruiser, as the flashing lights and municipal decals represented the absolute pinnacle of communal security and authoritative protection. For teenagers standing on the humid shoulder of a Florida highway, the sight of a uniformed officer extending a friendly invitation to climb into the passenger seat was universally perceived as a guaranteed, heavily sanctioned safe passage. However, this unquestioning reliance on the badge provided a horrifyingly perfect, state-sponsored camouflage for a profoundly disturbed predator who actively sought to completely subvert the very institution designed to hunt him. Gerard Schieffer, a young, seemingly dedicated patrolman who transitioned through various local law enforcement agencies, including the Wilton Manors Police Department and the Martin County Sheriff's Office, thoroughly recognized the catastrophic power embedded within his official uniform. He understood with chilling clarity that his authoritative status effortlessly bypassed the natural defensive instincts of his victims, granting him immediate, entirely uncontested physical access to the most vulnerable members of society. By systematically weaponizing the immense public trust placed in his occupation, Schieffer transformed the protective sanctuary of his patrol car into a heavily fortified, mobile trap from which there was absolutely no conventional avenue of escape. The sprawling, dense mangrove swamps and isolated coastal wilderness of Florida provided an infinitely expansive, unregulated hunting ground for an officer who could effortlessly execute his horrific compulsions under the impenetrable guise of routine police procedure. The terrifying reality of this institutional betrayal violently materialized in July 1972, abruptly shattering the naïve tranquility of the Florida coastline and initiating a sequence of events that would eventually expose a monstrous serial killer operating in plain sight. Two teenage girls, Nancy Ellen Trotter and Paula Ann Wells, were casually hitchhiking along a sun-baked stretch of highway, simply seeking a brief ride to a local destination. When they were approached by Deputy George Schaefer, operating his official patrol vehicle. Utilizing the inherent authority of his badge and uniform, Schaefer easily convinced the entirely unsuspecting teenagers to enter the cruiser, promising them a safe transport that immediately devolved into an unimaginable, highly calculated nightmare. Instead of delivering them to their intended location, the on-duty officer violently diverted his vehicle deep into the heavily isolated, mosquito-infested wilderness of Hutchinson Island, steering far away from any potential witnesses or passing motorists. Upon reaching a thoroughly secluded, dense thicket of mangrove trees, Schaefer forcefully ordered the terrified girls out of the car at gunpoint, systematically binding them to the massive trunks with thick ropes, and employing a chillingly calm, methodical demeanor that suggested extensive prior practice. He subsequently applied improvised nooses around their necks, forcing the teenagers to stand precariously on a tangle of slippery roots where the slightest physical exhaustion or misstep would instantly result in their brutal strangulation. The immediate, suffocating horror of their situation was compounded by the catastrophic realization that their captor was an active law enforcement officer, meaning that screaming for police assistance was not only futile, but practically suicidal. However, in a completely unforeseen stroke of miraculous luck, Schaefer was suddenly and urgently called away from his captive victims by his official police radio dispatcher, forcing him to temporarily abandon the torture site to respond to a routine municipal call. In his incredibly brief absence, the desperate, adrenaline-fueled teenagers managed to miraculously contort their bound limbs and slip completely free from the fatal nooses, executing a frantic, terrifying sprint through the unforgiving swampland until they finally flagged down a legitimate source of help. This harrowing, deeply traumatizing escape officially shattered Schaefer's absolute impunity, transforming a quiet afternoon patrol into a confirmed, highly documented instance of severe vehicular abduction perpetrated by a sworn agent of the state. The immediate law enforcement response to the girls' frantic allegations was severely compromised by a deeply entrenched institutional bias, leading to a profound, catastrophic miscarriage of justice that allowed the predator to minimize his exposure. When initially confronted by his superiors regarding the harrowing accusations of abduction and torture, Schaefer effortlessly deployed a highly manipulative, smoothly articulated defense, aggressively claiming that he was merely executing a misguided scared straight tactic to heavily discourage the girls from the inherent dangers of hitchhiking. Shockingly, the local judicial system largely accepted this bizarre, entirely unprofessional rationalization, resulting in Schaefer being convicted of a drastically reduced charge of aggravated assault and receiving an incredibly lenient sentence of merely 1 year in the county jail. While he ultimately served only a few short months before being released back into society, his highly publicized dismissal from the police force permanently stripped him of his official uniform, though it entirely failed to extinguish his deep-seated, intensely violent compulsions. During his brief incarceration and subsequent release, Investigators were completely unaware that the disgraced former deputy had already utilized his patrol cruiser to permanently eradicate multiple other young women, whose disappearances had been improperly classified as routine runaways. The investigative landscape remained agonizingly fragmented as frantic families desperately searched for missing teenagers like Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, who had completely vanished after reportedly being seen in the company of a mysterious, unnamed police officer. Detectives found themselves constantly hitting absolute dead ends, heavily struggling to connect the disparate missing persons reports across various jurisdictions because the local authorities fundamentally refused to believe that one of their own could be a prolific, highly organized serial killer. Despite his official termination, Schieffer continuously stalked the local thoroughfares, repeatedly attempting to lure highly vulnerable women into his civilian vehicle by entirely leaning on his residual authoritative confidence and deeply manipulative charm. The community remained trapped in a state of paralyzing, unresolved anxiety, entirely oblivious to the fact that the legal system had just successfully released a meticulously practicing psychopath back onto the sun-baked streets of their coastal paradise. The complete failure of the courts to accurately assess the extreme danger posed by Schieffer effectively guaranteed that a massive, horrifying cache of physical evidence was currently sitting entirely undisturbed, quietly waiting for diligent detectives to finally unearth the true magnitude of his butchery. The fragile, agonizing stalemate surrounding the missing teenagers was violently and permanently shattered in April 1973, culminating in a series of horrific discoveries that definitively exposed the true, catastrophic depth of Schieffer's unrestrained sadism. A massive, highly coordinated police search of the dense, unforgiving wilderness on Hutchinson Island, the exact same isolated geography where he had previously tortured Trotter and Wells, eventually resulted in the grim unearthing of heavily mutilated, decomposed skeletal remains. Forensic pathologists meticulously analyzing the tragic crime scene definitively identified the victims as the long-missing Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, determining that they had been subjected to unimaginable, prolonged physical torment before being callously discarded in a shallow, water-logged grave. Armed with this undeniable, absolutely horrific physical evidence directly linking the discarded bodies to the exact location of Schieffer's prior, highly publicized arrest, investigators immediately secured a comprehensive search warrant for his living quarters at his mother's residence. As heavily armed detectives systematically breached the threshold of his heavily secured bedroom, they did not encounter a typical living space, but rather a meticulously organized, deeply terrifying museum of absolutely unrestrained, highly organized serial murder. The search team systematically uncovered an incredibly massive, horrifying trove of gruesome victim souvenirs hidden in his personal belongings, including countless pieces of identifiable jewelry, preserved driver's licenses, and entirely unmistakable human teeth extracted from his numerous victims. Even more devastating to the hardened investigators was the discovery of a heavily detailed, explicitly graphic, entirely handwritten manuscript titled Killer Fiction, in which Schieffer meticulously documented his brutal, highly localized torture sessions under the incredibly thin, transparent veil of fictional literature. This staggering, overwhelmingly massive collection of physical trophies and written confessions provided absolute, undeniable proof that Schieffer was not a misguided officer executing a harsh lesson, but rather a profoundly sadistic serial killer who had successfully murdered potentially dozens of innocent women. The sheer volume of the recovered, highly personalized artifacts immediately allowed authorities to conclusively link the disgraced deputy to a multitude of completely unresolved missing persons cases stretching across the entire Florida peninsula. This clinical, incredibly precise execution of the search warrant fundamentally collapsed Schieffer's meticulously crafted facade of authority, completely exposing him as one of the most prolific, utterly depraved monsters to ever infiltrate the ranks of American law enforcement. Following the catastrophic, highly publicized revelation of his expansive murder trophy collection, Gerard Schieffer was immediately brought to trial, facing overwhelming, entirely insurmountable forensic evidence and the deeply chilling words of his own documented writings. in a courtroom heavily guarded against his deeply manipulative, highly aggressive legal tactics. A deeply traumatized jury formally convicted the former deputy of the brutal, first-degree murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. Fully recognizing the extreme severity of his crimes, the presiding judge subsequently handed down 2 consecutive life sentences, ensuring that the disgraced officer would be permanently incarcerated within the maximum security confines of the Florida state prison system, permanently stripped of the immense authority he had so fundamentally corrupted. Despite only being officially convicted of 2 homicides, law enforcement behavioral analysts and regional cold case detectives confidently attribute upwards of 30 distinct, completely unsolved murders to his horrific, highly mobile vehicular rampage across the southern state. Schaefer spent his remaining decades behind bars, continuously attempting to manipulate the media and further torment the grieving families of his suspected victims by aggressively challenging his convictions and publishing his vile, entirely remorseless writings. His terrifying existence was ultimately abruptly terminated in 1995 when a fellow inmate within the heavily fortified prison walls violently stabbed him to death, delivering a bloody, incredibly violent conclusion to a life defined entirely by the infliction of pain. The devastating legacy of his crimes fundamentally, permanently altered the way law enforcement agencies vet their recruits, serving as a deeply horrific, permanent warning about the absolute catastrophic consequences of allowing a highly organized predator to operate behind a legally sanctioned badge. The tragedy of the young women who completely trusted his uniform remains a stark, enduring testament to the unimaginable dangers that can sometimes lurk within the very institutions explicitly designed to protect the vulnerable. The chilling reality that a predator could utilize unquestioned authority and a designated vehicle to permanently erase innocent lives completely shattered the sunny illusion of the Florida coast. Yet, while Schaefer weaponized the sweltering, humid environment of the American South, a vastly different, geographically unforgiving frontier was currently harboring a wealthy, highly meticulous hunter who used the absolute isolation of the frozen Alaskan wilderness to execute his own airborne and vehicular atrocities. In the sprawling, rapidly developing city of Anchorage, Alaska during the late 1970s and early 1980s, the massive construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System brought an unprecedented influx of transient workers, vast amounts of cash, and highly illicit underground industries to the frozen frontier. Anchorage's downtown, particularly the notoriously rugged Spenard district, became heavily populated with strip clubs, dive bars, and highly vulnerable women working in the deeply marginalized sex trade or simply seeking temporary refuge from severe economic hardship. The brutally unforgiving Alaskan climate made hitchhiking or accepting rides an absolute, deadly necessity for these women, as standing outside in the freezing, pitch-black darkness could quickly prove just as lethal as stepping into a stranger's warm vehicle. Amidst this chaotic, gold rush atmosphere of temporary fortunes and extreme isolation, a mild-mannered, deeply respected local businessman named Robert Hansen operated a highly successful commercial bakery, projecting the perfect, unimpeachable image of a quiet, hardworking family man. Hansen was a wealthy, highly experienced hunting enthusiast who proudly owned a private Piper Super Cub airplane, an incredibly potent status symbol that firmly entrenched him within the upper echelons of Alaskan society and completely insulated him from any preliminary police suspicion. He meticulously weaponized his affluent, entirely harmless demeanor to seamlessly navigate the seedy underbelly of the city, utilizing his comfortable vehicle to quietly pick up marginalized women directly from the snow-covered streets. These deeply vulnerable victims, entirely disconnected from traditional family support networks and routinely ignored by mainstream society, were merely trying to survive the harsh economic and physical realities of the frozen north. They willingly climbed into the heated passenger seat of Hansen's unassuming truck, expecting a brief, entirely transactional encounter that would quickly return them to the safety of the neon-lit avenues. However, they were entirely oblivious to the fact that their polite, stuttering driver harbored a monstrous, highly organized compulsion to hunt human beings for pure sport. The vast, impenetrable wilderness surrounding Anchorage provided an infinitely expansive, completely unregulated playground for an apex predator equipped with the massive financial resources and aviation skills necessary to make his victims vanish without a single trace. The grim, entirely horrifying reality of Hansen's localized hunting operation began to silently manifest through a highly disturbing pattern of disappearances that initially completely failed to trigger any significant law enforcement alarm. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, young women frequenting the transient street corners and underground networks of Anchorage started vanishing entirely from the city grid, leaving behind abandoned apartments and deeply concerned peers. Because many of these missing women lived highly transient lifestyles, frequently moving across state lines or deliberately avoiding any official police contact, local authorities routinely and tragically dismissed their sudden absences as voluntary relocations rather than undeniable evidence of systemic foul play. This profound, catastrophic institutional indifference provided Hansen with an unimaginable level of operational freedom, allowing him to aggressively escalate his vehicular abductions without fearing an organized, multi-agency investigation. The true, deeply terrifying nature of these disappearances only began to emerge when construction workers and local hunters started inadvertently discovering heavily decomposed, unidentified human remains scattered across the desolate expanses of the Nick River and the deeply isolated Seward Peninsula. These initial, grim recoveries revealed a highly disturbing, entirely uniform methodology, indicating that the women had been transported far beyond the city limits, subjected to unimaginable trauma, and ultimately gunned down in the remote Alaskan bush. The realization that a highly organized, heavily equipped serial killer was actively utilizing the vast wilderness to execute marginalized women slowly began to dawn upon the few dedicated investigators who absolutely refused to ignore the rapidly escalating body count. Despite the mounting evidence of a localized massacre, the Anchorage Police Department remained severely fragmented, heavily struggling to connect the disparate missing persons reports to the anonymous bodies being excavated from the frozen permafrost. The predator's immense geographical advantage, facilitated entirely by his unmonitored private aircraft, allowed him to deposit his victims in terrains so hostile and inaccessible that natural scavengers and harsh weather routinely destroyed crucial forensic evidence. This terrifying capability to completely erase a human life within the seemingly infinite expanse of the Alaskan frontier cemented a suffocating atmosphere of dread among the city's vulnerable populations, who finally realized they were being methodically hunted by a phantom of the snow. The sheer, unprecedented scale of this hunting operation heavily underscored the catastrophic danger faced by those who relied on the charity of strangers to survive. The agonizingly slow, deeply frustrating investigative crawl was violently and permanently interrupted in June 1983 when a resilient, deeply traumatized teenage sex worker named Cindy Paulson managed to execute a miraculous, adrenaline-fueled escape from the very jaws of the predator. Paulson had initially accepted a ride from Hansen under the guise of a standard transaction, only to be violently subdued at gunpoint, chained inside his suburban home, and subjected to horrific abuse before being forced into his vehicle for a fateful drive to Merrill Field Airport. As Hansen meticulously prepared his private Piper Super Cub for a flight into the deep wilderness, fully intending to release Paulson and hunt her down with a high-powered rifle like wild game, the terrified teenager seized a fleeting, critical moment of distraction to break completely free from his grasp. She sprinted frantically across the busy aviation tarmac, desperately flagging down a passing commercial truck, while still restrained by handcuffs, ultimately providing local authorities with a detailed, harrowing account of her abduction and an exact physical description of the wealthy baker. However, the deeply entrenched institutional bias within the local police department severely hindered the initial law enforcement response, as detectives completely refused to believe that a highly respected, affluent business owner could possibly be responsible for such savage violence against a marginalized street worker. Hansen possessed a rock-solid, entirely fabricated alibi provided by his loyal friends, allowing him to smoothly navigate the preliminary police interrogations and successfully dismiss Paulson's entirely accurate accusations as an attempted financial extortion plot. Despite this catastrophic failure to immediately apprehend the suspect, a deeply persistent, highly dedicated state trooper named Glenn Flawed firmly recognized the chilling similarities between Paulson's terrifying testimony and the unresolved murders of the women previously discovered in a wilderness. Flawed aggressively petitioned the Federal Bureau of Investigation for assistance, securing an incredibly accurate psychological profile from legendary behavioral analyst John Douglas, who perfectly described the killer as a severely stuttering, highly organized hunter who specifically targeted vulnerable women to compensate for deep-seated psychological insecurities. Armed with this definitive federal guidance, Flawed meticulously compiled years of circumstantial evidence, complex flight logs, and previously overlooked witness statements, methodically building a comprehensive, undeniable dossier that legally justified a massive intrusion into the affluent Baker's private life. The investigative momentum finally shifted from passive observation to highly aggressive action, as Flawed successfully convinced a highly skeptical judge to issue a sweeping search warrant for Hansen's residence, bakery, and heavily utilized private aircraft. This massive bureaucratic breakthrough definitively signaled the beginning of the end for the city's most prolific and untouchable predator. On a crisp, fateful morning in September 1983, heavily armed state troopers and forensic technicians simultaneously executed comprehensive raids on Hansen's suburban property and his commercial bakery, initiating a massive search that would uncover one of the most chilling caches of evidence in modern criminal history. As investigators meticulously tore through the suspect's seemingly normal, comfortable home, they systematically unearthed an absolutely massive, horrifying collection of deeply incriminating artifacts completely hidden within the dark insulation of his attic. The search team successfully recovered the exact high-powered firearms used to violently execute the women in the wilderness, alongside a staggering, deeply macabre trove of stolen jewelry and personal identification cards that served as highly personalized trophies of his horrific conquests. However, the absolute pinnacle of the investigation, the definitive master key that instantly unlocked the entire devastating scope of the Alaskan nightmare, was discovered quietly folded away in a dusty corner of the perpetrator's master bedroom. Detectives located a highly detailed, specialized aviation flight map heavily marked with dozens of distinct, meticulously placed X, representing a deeply terrifying, entirely accurate geographical ledger of his hidden, frozen graveyards. This chilling documentary evidence provided absolute, undeniable proof that Hansen had systematically transported his victims into the most unforgiving, inaccessible sectors of the Alaskan frontier, releasing them into the freezing wilderness solely to hunt them down like wild animals. Confronted with the overwhelming, insurmountable weight of the physical evidence, the stolen jewelry, and his own meticulously maintained murder map, Hansen's carefully constructed facade of affluent respectability thoroughly and instantly collapsed inside the sterile interrogation room. In a desperate, highly calculated maneuver to entirely avoid facing the death penalty or serving his sentence within a harsh, highly dangerous state penitentiary, the mild-mannered Baker officially confessed to the brutal murders of 17 women and the violent assaults of dozens more. The sterile, quiet environment of the police station stood in stark, deeply disturbing contrast to the unimaginable, freezing terror his victims experienced during their final moments, desperately running through the snow as a heavily armed predator tracked them from the sky. The definitive, horrifying confirmation of his guilt completely shattered the communal trust of the entire Alaskan territory, proving that true monsters frequently hide behind the mask of success. The subsequent judicial resolution was executed with rapid, unprecedented efficiency, as the massive mountain of forensic evidence and Hansen's own comprehensive, highly detailed confession completely eliminated the need for a protracted, deeply traumatic public trial. In February 1984, the man widely known as the Butcher Baker was definitively convicted of multiple counts of murder and kidnapping, resulting in a staggering monumental sentence of 461 years plus life without any possibility of parole. As a direct, heavily enforced condition of his highly negotiated plea agreement, Hansen was heavily guarded and forced to actively participate in extensive helicopter-borne recovery operations, manually guiding state troopers through the dense, unforgiving Alaskan bush to retrieve the frozen remains of his hidden victims. Despite these massive, heavily funded logistical efforts, several of the marked grave sites on his terrifying aviation map remained entirely undiscovered due to the brutal terrain and the immense passage of time, leaving several families without the final, definitive closure they so desperately sought. Hansen was permanently exiled to a maximum security federal penitentiary, entirely stripped of his wealth, his private aircraft, and the vast wilderness he had so ruthlessly weaponized against the marginalized women of Anchorage. He lived out his remaining decades in absolute, highly controlled isolation, completely fading into obscurity until his eventual, unceremonious death from natural causes within the prison's medical wing in the summer of 2014. The catastrophic legacy of his deeply organized, highly affluent reign of terror fundamentally altered the way Alaskan authorities view missing persons reports originating from transient communities, heavily reinforcing the absolute necessity of treating every disappearance with immense, immediate gravity. His terrifying ability to seamlessly blend vast financial resources, aviation skills, and an unassuming public persona created a profoundly unique, entirely inescapable nightmare for the women who simply wanted a warm ride on a freezing night. As we reflect upon these deeply harrowing accounts of vehicular predation across the nation, from the humid swamps of Florida to the frozen tundra of Alaska, a singular, intensely chilling theme permanently binds these diverse tragedies together. The open road, with all its promises of absolute freedom and rapid transit, consistently harbors an invisible, ever-present danger, forcing us to finally confront the profoundly terrifying reality of the strangers we pass every single day. The open road promises boundless freedom, yet it remains a vast, unregulated void where the simple, trusting act of asking for a ride can permanently intersect with the darkest impulses of human nature. As you lock your car doors tonight, you are left to wonder, how well do we truly know the anonymous faces passing us in the dark, and what unseen monsters are patiently idling at the next intersection? Thank you for watching.